Good morning, everyone, and another warm welcome from my workplace. Actually, it's not a warm welcome. Our heating's been playing up, so actually, I'm pretty darn chilly this morning. But a smiley welcome at the very least. We are inching ever closer to December and the run into you know what. And actually, we are beginning our Advent series this week. We've actually jumped the gun a bit because Advent doesn't officially start till next weekend, but we're starting a week early. And today we're going to launch straight in because I'm going to be speaking, I guess, on an Advent theme, but we're going to be doing that through the passage of Luke 21. It's Luke 21. Let me just look at my Bible here, verses 25 to 36. So hit the pause button, have a read of that, those few verses, just read it quite carefully and keep your Bibles open because we're going to be, particularly in the first part, looking at some of that in quite close detail. But I'll catch you in a minute after you've had the opportunity to just read those few verses. As I said, this is going to kick off our Advent series. And through the weeks of Advent, we'll be looking at the early part of Luke's narrative, looking at all the events that lead up to the birth of Jesus, which we'll celebrate in big style on Christmas Day. But you'll notice that this morning we're not starting at the beginning. We've jumped right in at chapter 21, which is near the tail end of Luke's narrative. And this passage is often used to set up Advent themes, if you like, the themes of watchfulness and waiting. So we're going to start here, and I'm going to use it to invite you into something for the season of Advent. I'll come back to what that is. But what I want to do first of all is just give a little bit of explanation to some of the verses and phrases in the passage that we've just read, because down the years they've caused a bit of confusion for people, and I would say even sent some people down some rabbit holes that are fairly unhelpful, and particularly when it's thinking about something that is often referred to as the end times. So we're going to have a quick bit of teaching on that, but I do want to shift focus to what I think is actually the main point of action of this section, and that's to look at this thing that we can take into the season of Advent. So that's where we're headed. Get your Bibles open because, like I said, we're going to look quite closely, and we'll jump in at verse 25. But before we do that, as is often the case, it's worth just having a quick look over your shoulder and saying, okay, we've jumped in at verse 25. What came before? And what has come before is Jesus has just been to the temple with his disciples, and they've done a bit of a post-visit reflection. And the disciples have been going, wow, how amazing is that building? They have just been blown away by how awe-inspiring it is, the scale of it, everything. And Jesus, he rather bursts their bubble by saying, well, yeah, but it's all coming down. And he prophesies the destruction of the temple, which we know historically goes on to happen in AD 70. But that news, which is massively ground shaking for a good Jewish man, that's the bit that's just come before what we've read. So you've kind of moved from one rather foreboding picture into what appears to be another one, which, as I hinted at, is often labelled or understood as the end times. The problem is, if you read chapter 21 as a whole, that shift in talking about the destruction of the temple and the move to the end times, it's not really clearly signalled by Luke. And so there's debate, there's discussion as to what exactly Luke is talking about and at what point. And the bigger question, actually, is he really referring to the end times in this section? Now, we'll start off with just a slightly looser notion before answering that question. We'll say, okay, he's clearly making reference to some future drama unfolding. And then we'll move on to ask the question, okay, is he really talking about the end times as it's kind of commonly understood? So first up, jump in at verse 25. You get this phrase, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Now, as we go through the early narrative in the coming weeks, you'll see that actually this idea of there being signs in the sun, moon, and stars, that we can understand that quite literally. And that wouldn't be an unusual reading if you think about just some of the events, like I said, of the early events, the Magi following the star in order to get to Jesus, for instance. Visible cues up there, if you like, that they are part, and they're just part of a biblical narrative. And there is not a problem with having a fairly literal understanding of that. But here, just bear in mind that this particular phrase, there will be signs in the sun, moon and stars, that was a phrase that was actually quite well known in Luke's day. And it's simply a phrase that was code for the great nations and kingdoms of the earth and how, I guess using our own picture language, they will go through convulsions. It's a phrase that speaks of disruption. Now, I guess the hard part for us, if we are even inclined to start thinking about, okay, how do we date what's going on here, is that actually, has there ever been a point in history when that hasn't been going on, when there hasn't been conflict between nations, when there hasn't been disruption, when there hasn't been these sort of signs? So we kind of park that thought for a moment, because it moves quite quickly on to the sense that whatever's happening, it's going to strike a particularly crippling fear into the hearts of people. It talks about men fainting from terror. And then it runs straight into this expression that you get in verse 27. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, this is where it gets interesting, perhaps, though, a little more foggy. There is a frame of reference to this that we have to pick up on. This is language that is lifted from the book of Daniel. Daniel 7, to be more specific, and actually that phrase itself comes from verse 13. Now, we haven't got time this morning to read the whole of chapter 7 of Daniel, but in your own time, go and check it out. Particularly if you like the fantasy genre of books or films, you're going to love Daniel 7. It's kind of trippy, apocalyptic stuff. It's hardcore. But this prophecy in Daniel, it was one of the most popular prophecies of the day in Jesus' time. And it includes this phrase, the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the Son of Man in a cloud, which has been popularly heard kind of almost in the literal sense as a human figure traveling down towards Earth on actual clouds. Now, you could say, well, that's completely overlooking the genre of the literature. But again, park that for a moment. The word coming itself can actually be translated as coming or going. But even if you put that aside, just take a closer look at Daniel 7 and see from which perspective the drama is being played out. Because actually, in Daniel 7, the drama is being understood from the perspective of heaven and not earth. So when it talks about the Son of Man, this Son of Man figure coming to the Ancient of Days, it's coming from earth to heaven. And that's the sign, the vindication of him after a period of suffering. You with me so far? You might be thinking, yeah, that's fine, but so what? Well, the implication is that more recent scholarship would say that this passage then in Luke is best understood as the promise that when Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that opposed Jesus' message, when Jerusalem was toppled and overthrown, and more specifically the temple, that would be the vindication of Jesus and his people. Rather crudely put, that's the point at which he was proved right. And that sign that Jesus, as Son of Man himself, enters heaven and is enthroned at his Father's side, taking his heavenly royal seat, that's the apocalyptic figurative imagery employed for this moment in history, when Jerusalem, when the temple is sacked. And that reading, if you think about it, makes perhaps more sense in the overall flow of chapter 21. Because as I explained at the beginning, Jesus has been talking about that very subject, the fall of Jerusalem. And so it just seems like a natural continuation of what he's talking about, rather than that, at what point did Jesus or Luke start talking about the end times? I'm not quite sure when he's kind of signaled that shift. Arguably, it also makes a bit more sense of what comes afterwards, because if you look at verse 23, it goes, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. If Luke was referencing the end times, then on the face of it, that statement doesn't make a whole lot of sense. After all, lots of generations have come and gone since Jesus said this. whereas the destruction of the temple indeed took place within the lifetime of that generation. Now, I wouldn't want to leave it all nicely wrapped up with a neat bow for you, because actually there are different ways of even understanding that phrase that we've just translated, this generation. In some Bibles, in fact in mine, it's got a little footnote that says all race. But the point is that word that's been translated generation can mean, I guess it carries this sense of a kind of people, including successive generations. So even there's kind of different ways of understanding it. But I guess the interpretation that I'm suggesting may be the way to go. It feels like that is a more natural fit. Now, all of that may seem a little technical and heavy going, so let's simplify for a moment. I'm not sure that Luke is referring to the end times here in Acts 21. Would I go to the stake for that? No. And just to be really, really clear, Luke certainly believes in Jesus' second coming. Just go a little bit further forward, check out Acts 1. But I'm not sure that that's what he's referring to here. Now, that may help you to make sense of a passage that has left you scratching your head at times. I hope that it's of some use and it doesn't feel completely esoteric point for those who have a kind of a weird taste in biblical theology. I'm just conscious that at times and in certain places the church has got lost in some of that, in the ways that it's thought about what's going on here. But like I said, I want to shift gear, and actually this is where I really want to emphasize this morning. And I want to move something that I hope will be more universally applicable to everyone, to everybody, to all of you watching online. And I think it addresses a malaise that is particularly prevalent in our time. And it comes out of the passage, but we're going to apply it very specifically through the challenge of 2021 living. Because however you understand what Jesus is referring to in this passage, in those early verses in particular, where it ends up is that Jesus kind of comes into land with a particular charge. If you look at verse 34, he says, "Be careful." Other translations put it like this: "Be on your guard." And he says, because if you don't take care, if you're not on your guard, what's going to happen is this. You'll end up with a heavy heart. You will have your hearts weighed down by three things. This unholy trinity that he talks about of dissipation, drunkenness, and anxieties or worries. And Jesus offers a really simple way that we can take care, that we can be on guard. I think it's misleadingly simple, but he says to be on our guard is to keep watch and pray. Simple as that. Keep watch and pray. It's the very thing that he asks Peter, James, and John to do in the Garden of Gethsemane. Keep watch and pray. But much like the dozers that they were who fall asleep on the job, I don't think we find this easy, actually. And what we're talking about today is this practice, I guess, this Advent practice of watchfulness, attentiveness, and prayerfulness. And yes, of course, they are all year round Christian practices, but they can become a particular area of focus during the season of Advent. They can come into sharp relief during this season. And if I were to try and give this idea a slightly more contemporary spin, I guess I would talk about moving from distraction to being present, using Advent to move away from one state of being in order to move into another. Now, you'll notice that, as we've already talked about, that Luke talks about this generation. I think we could probably call ourselves the distracted generation. And not least of all, this little device here, which ain't going away anytime soon, is a wonderful tool for distraction. I think I may have shared with you before, but the average iPhone user touches their phone, I think it's 2,617 times per day. I don't know whether it's more or less for Android users because they have a less satisfying experience. I'm only joking, I'm actually an Android user. But if you give yourself 14 waking hours in a day, that's touching one of these things 186 times in an hour. 186 times you're tapping in. That's from a study conducted back in 2016, which in our times, that's kind of old news. And I'm guessing that statistic hasn't improved. If you saw the Social Dilemma on Netflix, you'll know the worrying conclusions that docudrama drew, that the makers of social media tools deliberately design their apps to be addictive. And this thing is like a technological syringe of dopamine being kind of injected into our system to give us a little lift, to promise us a lift. And no doubt that's part of the reason why 79% apparently of smartphone users check their device within 15 minutes of waking up. We roll out of bed and we switch it on and we're there in it within 15 minutes. If you think for a moment about that third member of that unholy trinity that I referred to, anxiety, worry, cares about this world, this device feeds that big style. And there is just a growing mound of research that indicates that those of us who are heavy smartphone users are more likely to grapple with mental health challenges, with anxiety, with depression. Now, it's not that social media or smartphones are inherently evil, but we need to start owning in a more honest way, I'd say, that we're willingly distracted people. We're living in what C.S. Lewis's devil in the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape himself, called the kingdom of the noise. And that little book, by the way, was written back in the 1940s. Goodness knows what descriptor he would give to our present time. And this is just one source of the many that are around us that increase the external noise in our lives, all of which is creating something way more troubling. All the external noise is actually just building the more troubling phenomenon, which is internal noise. Our inability to be silent and reflective, which in turn threatens our capacity to be purposeful and productive. But what we're focusing on today, most of all, of being present, or to use Jesus' language, it hampers our ability to watch and pray. Now, we could spend a lot of time exploring the different ways this noisy, distracted world impacts us, the way it costs us, I would say. Again, all sorts of research is emerging on how it limits our ability to think, our ability to be creative, our ability to cultivate depth, and just the sheer volume of information that we are exposed to on a daily basis. That is a problem. Why? Because God didn't just make our minds to hoover up information, to receive information. We're designed to think about and actually make creative connections between everything that is coming into our noddles. So if we fail to make time to do that sort of reflecting and thinking, let alone do it alone in quiet, it will sort of happen in a slightly dysfunctional way when we're around others, when we're around our spouse and our kids and our friends. We won't be fully present to them. We'll be people who have that slightly distracted look, the kind of ones who look a little bit over the shoulder into the distance, kind of a slightly glazed, not completely there in the moment. And even if we find the space to turn down the external noise, hide in the understated cupboard like Harry Potter, the internal noise still blares because our brains are trying to process and connect all the information that we've been receiving through the day. That's just one kind of simple overview of how this is impacting us. But for me, two of the most damaging symptoms of this distracted existence for me are this. One is our inability to be at peace. And two is the limit it seems to place on our ability to listen to God's voice. Let's quickly take the first of those, and the fact that, generally speaking, always wary of trading generalizations, but generally speaking, we appear to be a more anxious people. And it's not just the noise of social media, but it's the full sweep of all the different forms of noise that produce this overwhelm for us. Let me just target the news for a moment. According to Time magazine, more than half of the people in the US, and I think by extension in the West, say that the news causes them stress. Well, go figure. And many report feeling anxiety, fatigue, or sleep loss as a result. And yet, 1 in 10 adults check the news every hour. Up to 20% of us report constantly monitoring our social feeds for headlines, whether we like it or not. That is certifiably insane. We are literally making ourselves anxious by welcoming all this noise into our lives. Digital news services, they're a quicksand. If you do a quick comparison, just think of that great passage from Philippians 4, where Paul he's talking about anxiety, and he's trying to offer ways in which we can inhabit the worry-free life. And he invites us to think on what is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Most news, not so much, doesn't fall under that umbrella, does it? Now, this isn't a plea to be ignorant of current affairs. It's a call to recognise that the pace and the type of consumption that we pursue, that's important. It has an impact on us. And just as a little aside, go back to our unholy trinity. Recognise the connection between the three of them. Recognise that the unholy trinity of dissipation, which is a fancy word for indulging the senses, drunkenness, and then anxiety, that they are intimately connected. Because when we are unsettled, when we're anxious, when we're not at peace, the temptation to turn to the other two members of that trio, it goes up massively. That little voice inviting you to self-medicate. Just do something that's going to feel good in the moment. Help you forget the anxiety, numb the pain a little, just give you a little lift. Out of all of this, though, I guess what vexes me most as your vicar, and this is about my own personal life, but about our life collectively. It's that reality that all this noise that we expose ourselves to, it shrivels our ability to listen to the one voice that we need to hear most. Tim Keller rather hauntingly said that this constant exposure to the noise of the world, we are inflicting ourselves with what he called the torture of divine absence. So our quiet times, if we have them, aren't actually that quiet. Yeah, we can read our Bibles, we can be in a room that's quiet in the sense that we're not speaking, but our minds are still noisy because they're playing catch up with all that consumption of information. It's probably with that thought and at this point worth distinguishing between hearing and listening to God's voice. That well-known Psalm 46, in which our Father, he invites us to be still and know that he is God. There's an author called Emily Freeman, and she commented on this verse, and I love what she says. This is quite a long quote, but it's good. She goes like this. Let me just read it to you. There's a reason why God invites us to be still first. The stillness makes way for the knowing. Stillness is to my soul as decluttering is to my home. Silence and stillness are how I sift through the day's input. And I love this little imagery. The silence serves as a colander, helping me discern what I need to hold on to and allowing what I don't need to fall away gently, making space to access courage and creativity, quieting to hear the voice of God. Just listening to that just feels like food, like tonic for the soul. So what are we going to do about all this? I want to keep it really simple, and I want to keep it quite narrow in focus. But for the season of Advent, at the very least, and who knows, let's be really brave and think about maybe continuing it beyond Advent, but let's start with Advent. I want first of all to run after a simple aim of bringing down that number, the 2,617 touches per day. That's the first part. That's the from distracted. And the second part is to run after to present, and chiefly to be present to God. Someone asks in the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, they go, what would my life be like if God touched my mind as frequently as I touch my phone? Just ponder that thought for a moment, that actually we were so attentive, so present to God, that actually that 180 whatever touches a day was 180 times that we connect really intentionally with God, that we made ourselves more available to him. So that's kind of what I'm suggesting we're going to try and pursue through Advent. And here is just a list of 3 things, and I invite you to take 1 or 2 of them and experiment with them through Advent. You don't have to take these exactly as they are. You can tailor them according to your circumstances and kind of where you feel your point of weakness is. And like I said, these are deceptively simple, but I don't think they're actually that easy to see through, not least of all over the longer term. So the first is turn the notifications on your phone, turn them off. Get rid of all those newsfeed beeps and other forms of notification that constantly kind of go ping, ping, ping in your mind. And the kind of second part, the sort of making yourself present to, actually replace your home screen or your wallpaper with what I would call a God nudge. I heard of one woman changing the wallpaper on her phone to a question. And the question was this. She said, Jesus, how do you see this? So whenever she picked up her phone, that question sort of eyeballed her, stared her down. But pick whatever works for you, something that draws your attention onto God. First thing, super simple. Second thing, these get progressively harder, by the way. Leave it at least half an hour, maybe go even more radical than that, maybe go for a full hour before you turn your phone on from waking up. And then do something similar at the other end. Turn it off an hour or 2 even before going to bed. So you've got space at the beginning and the end of your day that is phone free, that is noise free from that particular source of noise. And that in itself, I think, would probably have positive benefits, but we want to do more than that. We want the 2 present things. So in that space that you're freeing up from your phone, see if you can carve out some silence and solitude time. Start small. Start with just 5 minutes, if that's all you can manage. Just you and a Bible and nothing else. Or just you outside in nature praying and nothing else. But just minimize the amount of distractions that are around you in order to connect more fully with God. That's the second one. Third one, and final one. This is possibly a challenging one, but practice what I would call a tech Sabbath for one day in a week, for one 24-hour period in the week. And if you're feeling really brave, get the whole family to do it. But if that's not going to fly, then just try it yourself. Get a box, get a drawer, and shove your phone in it and leave it in there. And don't go to it for a full 24 hours. And do other stuff that celebrates how God made you. Bake cakes, play games, whatever it might be, but just enjoy God's creation, who God's made you to be, and give thanks to him and consciously express that thanks to him. Now, as you're hearing that, just notice the reaction inside you. You are most likely going, whoa, John, that is completely unrealistic. It's never going to happen. Take that just as a sign of how strangled we are by this. Because actually, it is quite possible. For 99.9% of human history, people have been living without mobile smartphones. It's doable. And it just shows kind of the hold that it has on us. Now, those are just 3 things. You can think of others, and there may be variations of those that you want to work with. Like I said, they sound simple, sound even trivial, I might suggest. But I can guarantee you will find that hard if you are one of the people who is in any way beset what I've been articulating today. hopefully that will serve to free ourselves up to engage, to watch and pray as Jesus explains in this passage. I'm gonna try a couple of those things myself. And in irony of ironies, I'm going to post through the WhatsApp group, but not early in the morning or late in the evening, little remarks about how it's going, or just little nudges for people to engage with themselves. So there's a sense in which we're doing this together as a church family, and we'll see how it goes. And we'll be honest about saying, actually finding this really, really hard, or I'm experiencing this benefit, or even better, I'm hearing God say to me this through these new moments of connecting with him. Because ultimately that's what this is about. Actually, we want to hear more from God about how he wants us to do life, how he wants us to pursue his kingdom and his purposes where we live. So that's our charge for Advent, guys. I hope you're excited at that prospect, and join in on the discussions, on the little WhatsApp discussions, sparingly, as we pursue this together. Take care. God bless. Well, I hope that's given you a purposeful focus for the season of Advent. I didn't mention it in the sermon, but I love how this chapter 21, finishes up. It goes like this: each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. Now, it was a bit of a schlep, actually, from the temple to the Mount of Olives. And I'm pretty sure he did that for a reason. It was to get away and to spend some quiet time with the Father, as we hear him doing elsewhere in the Gospels, so that he could be replenished, that he could hear the Father's voice and be equipped for what lay ahead the following day. And kind of that's the model that we're looking to pursue ourselves during this season of Advent. So let's finish up by praying, shall we? Father, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for who you are. We give you thanks that you are a God who speaks. And as we work through Advent, help us to hear and listen to your voice. Help us to recognize it more clearly and to follow whatever it is that you call us to. And so as we look to perhaps just tinker with the way that we do things, and not least of all the way we expose ourselves to noise, we ask for your Spirit to be at work in us, to help us to move from distracted to present. We ask it in your name, Jesus. Amen. Take care, everyone. Have a really good week, and look out for those little WhatsApp messages that I will send every now and again. Good morning, everyone, and another warm welcome from my workplace. Actually, it's not a warm welcome. Our heating's been playing up, so actually I'm pretty darn chilly this morning, but a smiley welcome at the very least. We are inching ever closer to December and the run into you know what, and actually we are beginning our Advent series this week. We've actually jumped the gun a bit because Advent doesn't officially start till next weekend, but we're starting a week early. And today we're going to launch straight in because I'm going to be speaking, I guess, on an Advent theme, but we're going to be doing that through the passage of Luke 21. It's Luke 21. Let me just look at my Bible here, verses 25 to 36. So hit the pause button, have a read of that, those few verses, just read it quite carefully and keep your Bibles open because we're going to be, particularly in the first part, looking at some of that in quite close detail. But I'll catch you in a minute after you've had the opportunity to just read those few verses.